They said the Hawthorne girl would not dare attend the winter ball, and in the drawing rooms of the town her absence was already a form of entertainment. Silk-clad matrons leaned toward one another, their fans fluttering like cautious wings, and murmured that pride was an expensive ornament for a family so very poor. Outside the frost-rimmed windows of their gossip, the estate of the Hawthornes sagged beneath the weight of neglect, its once white pillars weathered to the color of old bone. Within those fading walls, Miss Eliza Hawthorne stood before a narrow mirror, her posture as composed as any duchess, though the candlelight betrayed the thinness of her gloves and the careful mending at their seams. Eliza had been born into gentility and reared in its expectations, yet fortune had slipped through her household like sand through an impatient hand. Her late father's investments had collapsed, her brother's education had consumed what little remained, and her mother, once admired for beauty and poise, had grown sharp with worry and humiliation. Mrs. Hawthorne possessed a pride that curdled easily into resentment, and she measured her daughter's youth as though it were coin yet to be spent. If Eliza felt the scrutiny, she bore it silently, cultivating in its place a quiet dignity that neither debt nor derision had managed to extinguish. The winter ball at Ashford House promised more than music and champagne. It offered the rarest currency in their dwindling world, visibility. Invitations had arrived embossed in gold, and Mrs. Hawthorne had held theirs as one might cradle a fragile reprieve from ruin. "You shall attend," she had declared, her voice a brittle command. "And you shall not appear as a beggar." Eliza had inclined her head, understanding that beneath her mother's severity lay a desperation sharpened by unpaid accounts and creditors' whispers. Yet in her own heart, the ball represented something gentler, a single evening in which she might be seen not as a liability but as herself. Her gown lay across the bed like a promise. It was pale blue silk, preserved through years of careful wrapping, once worn by her grandmother at a season when the Hawthorne name still commanded respect. Eliza brushed her fingers along its fabric with reverence, remembering the stories of candlelit waltzes and gallant suitors. She had altered it herself, stitching through the night to coax from its seams a modern grace, and in those patient hours she had imagined a future unbound by pity. The dress was not merely attire, it was inheritance, memory, and the fragile architecture of hope. Mrs. Hawthorne entered without knocking, her gaze calculating as it settled upon the gown. "It is our last asset of value," she observed, as though assessing a ledger rather than a legacy. Eliza turned, startled by the peculiar flatness in her mother's tone, but she answered with careful calm. "It is also our last remnant of honor," she replied. For a moment, silence hovered between them, thick as velvet. Then Mrs. Hawthorne's expression softened into something unreadable, and she murmured that she would call upon the modiste to ensure the alterations were acceptable. Eliza, trusting in that small concession, returned to her mirror with a heart cautiously alight. By afternoon, the sky had lowered into a pewter gloom, and a fine rain began to fall, stippling the windows with restless tears. Eliza, cloaked and gloved, made her way to the modiste's shop to retrieve the finished gown, her pulse fluttering with anticipation. Yet when she entered the perfumed warmth within, she was greeted not by congratulation but by confusion. The modiste, wringing her hands, confessed that the gown had already been collected, sold in fact at a handsome price, to a lady whose carriage had borne the Hawthorne crest as proof of authority. Eliza felt the floor tilt beneath her, as though the earth itself recoiled from such treachery. Her mother had sold it. Not for malice, perhaps, but for survival. The distinction offered little comfort. As Eliza stepped back into the rain, the truth unfurled with cruel clarity. She had been bartered without her consent, her dreams reduced to currency. The droplets soaked her bonnet and chilled her skin, yet she did not weep. Humiliation was a fire that burned too hot for tears. Around her, passers-by cast curious glances, already aware that the Hawthorne girl would arrive at the ball unadorned or not at all. Society delighted in such falls from grace, and she could almost hear the laughter threading through the damp air. She returned home to confront her mother, whose composure wavered only briefly under her daughter's steady gaze. "We required the funds," Mrs. Hawthorne insisted, clutching the purse as though it were salvation itself. "One evening's vanity cannot outweigh necessity." Eliza listened, her heart fracturing along lines long concealed. "It was not vanity," she said quietly. "It was the last thing that belonged to me." In that admission lay the true wound, not the loss of silk, but the revelation that her own household had deemed her expendable. Twilight settled, and the town's lamps flickered to life in anticipation of music and spectacle. From her window, Eliza watched carriages roll toward Ashford House, their lanterns glinting like distant stars. She could choose to remain within these dim walls, to surrender to humiliation and confirm society's verdict. Or she could walk into the ballroom unarmed by finery yet armored by resolve. The choice trembled before her, fragile as glass. As she descended the front steps, rain still whispering against the cobblestones, a sleek black carriage drew abruptly to a halt before the gate. Its horses stamped impatiently, their harness adorned with a silver crest she recognized at once, the sigil of Ashford House and of its formidable master, Lord Alaric Ashford, whom society had christened the Alpha for his unyielding command. The carriage door opened, and a gloved hand emerged into the rain, steady and deliberate. "Miss Hawthorne," came a deep, measured voice from within, carrying through the dusk with quiet authority, "it would appear the evening has not yet concluded its arrangements on your behalf." Rain traced silver paths along the lacquered surface of the carriage as Eliza stood motionless upon the steps, her pulse echoing louder than the restless hooves before her. The crest of Ashford House glinted upon the door in cold authority, a reminder that power often announced itself without apology. When the footman lowered the step, the lamplight revealed Lord Alaric Ashford himself within, his posture composed, his dark gaze unwavering beneath the brim of his hat. He did not look at her with pity nor with curiosity, but with an intention so deliberate it unsettled her more than mockery ever could. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, inclining his head with grave courtesy, "I find myself unwilling to permit injustice to dictate the tone of this evening." His voice bore neither urgency nor extravagance. It was measured, restrained, yet threaded with unmistakable command. Eliza felt the rain soak through her cloak, felt the humiliation of the afternoon still clinging to her skin, and yet she lifted her chin. "My lord," she answered carefully, "injustice and I are old acquaintances. I would not have you inconvenience yourself on my account." The faintest curve touched his mouth, not amusement but recognition. He extended his gloved hand, palm upward, an offering rather than an order. "Then consider it no inconvenience," he replied. "Consider it preference." That single word altered the air between them. Preference implied choice and choice implied value. Against the stern echo of her mother's betrayal, the notion rang with fragile promise. Eliza hesitated only a breath longer before placing her hand in his. The carriage door closed, sealing them within a cocoon of velvet shadow and muted lamplight. Inside, warmth gathered like a whispered conspiracy. The scent of polished leather and faint cedarwood replaced the sting of rain. Lord Ashford regarded her with attentive silence, as though measuring not her appearance but her resolve. "I was informed," he said at last, "that your gown met with an unfortunate transaction." The understatement sharpened her spine. "It was sold," she replied evenly, "by my mother. For reasons she deemed necessary." She refused to lower her gaze, though the admission cost her dearly. Alaric inclined his head once, acknowledging both the wound and her refusal to dramatize it. From the seat beside him he lifted a long narrow box of dark mahogany, its lid etched with delicate silver filigree. He placed it upon the space between them with solemn care. "Necessity," he murmured, "has a peculiar habit of mistaking sacrifice for virtue. I prefer precision." At his gesture she opened the lid. Within lay a gown of deep crimson velvet, its surface catching the carriage light like embers beneath ash. Silver embroidery traced the bodice in subtle constellations, each stitch deliberate, each seam promising strength rather than fragility. Eliza inhaled, startled not merely by its beauty but by its audacity. Crimson was not the color of invisibility, it was the color of declaration. "My lord," she whispered, closing the lid halfway as though shielding herself from its implications, "such a gift invites speculation." His expression did not waver. "Speculation thrives regardless," he answered. "Let it at least feast upon truth rather than timidity." She searched his face for condescension and found none. There was no softness in him, yet there was fairness, an unwavering belief that dignity ought not to be bartered for approval. The carriage halted before a discreet entrance to Ashford House, avoiding the scrutiny of the crowded front steps. A maid awaited them, summoned in advance, and Eliza was guided to a private dressing chamber warmed by a steady fire. As the crimson gown was fastened about her, she felt not adorned but armored. The velvet embraced her shoulders with reassuring weight, and the silver thread caught the firelight in restrained brilliance. When she faced the mirror once more, she did not see the girl whose inheritance had been sold, she saw a woman reclaimed. Lord Ashford waited beyond the door, impeccably composed. When she emerged, his gaze held steady for a long, assessing moment before he offered his arm. "Shall we?" he asked, as though inviting her to an equal venture rather than escorting her to spectacle. Together they stepped into the ballroom, where chandeliers spilled golden light upon polished floors and 100 conversations fluttered like startled birds. Silence rippled outward at their entrance. Fans stilled mid-gesture, glasses hovered unfinished. Eliza felt the weight of scrutiny settle upon her shoulders, yet the velvet steadied her breath. At her side, Alaric's posture did not falter. He neither tightened his grip nor sought to shield her. Instead, he walked at her pace, matching her stride with deliberate harmony. In that subtle alignment lay a gesture more intimate than gallantry. Whispers unfurled quickly. Some recognized the gown as new, too bold to be coincidence. Others calculated what advantage the alpha might seek in such conspicuous association. Across the room, Mrs. Hawthorne stood rigid, shock blanching her features as she beheld her daughter radiant in scarlet. The purse at her wrist seemed suddenly small, its contents trivial against the spectacle unfolding before her. A noble woman of sharp tongue and sharper ambition approached with a smile that cut like crystal. "Miss Hawthorne," she purred, "how swiftly misfortune transforms into favor." Eliza met her gaze without flinching. "Misfortune," she replied softly, "is seldom permanent, madam." The woman's eyes flicked to Lord Ashford, seeking confirmation or denial, but he merely regarded her with cool detachment. The orchestra, uncertain, faltered at the edge of its waltz. In that suspended hush, Alaric turned to Eliza and bowed with formal precision. "If you will grant me the honor," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to command attention, "I should prefer not to delay what I have long anticipated." Gasps stirred like wind through silk. It was not customary for the master of the house to open the floor with one so precariously placed within society's ranks. Eliza felt the choice crystallize within her once more. To accept was to step fully into scandal. To refuse was to retreat into the safety of obscurity. She placed her hand in his, steady now not from defiance alone but from awakening resolve. As they moved toward the center of the floor, the first strains of music resumed, tentative yet gathering courage. His hand settled at her waist, firm but respectful. "Allow them their whispers," he murmured near her ear, the words shaped for her alone yet audible in their intent. "I have long ceased living by the permission of lesser tongues." The waltz began, and with it a shift no gossip could easily contain. The waltz carried them through its measured turns, velvet and black wool circling beneath the blaze of chandeliers, yet for Eliza the music receded into a distant pulse, as though her heart alone conducted the rhythm. Lord Alaric Ashford guided her with precise restraint, never claiming more space than she offered, never allowing the press of watching eyes to dictate his composure. Around them, conversation swelled again, though now it bore a sharper timbre. Curiosity had ripened into speculation, and speculation into quiet alarm. The alpha of Ashford House did not squander gestures, and society knew it. When the final chord dissolved into applause, Alaric did not immediately release her. Instead, he inclined his head slightly toward the tall doors that opened onto the terrace. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his tone calm yet threaded with intention, "might I request a moment of air?" It was phrased as courtesy, yet it felt like inevitability. Eliza sensed the collective lean of the room, the hunger for interpretation, and understood that retreat would only embolden the whispers. "Of course, my lord," she answered, steady though her pulse fluttered. The terrace lay washed in moonlight, the rain having surrendered to a crisp, crystalline frost. Beyond the balustrade, the gardens of Ashford House stretched in disciplined symmetry, hedges trimmed to obedience, fountains stilled beneath winter's breath. The contrast struck her at once. Within, society shimmered in orchestrated splendor. Without, the night stood honest and unadorned. Alaric closed the doors behind them, muting the music to a distant murmur, and for the first time since his arrival at her gate, silence claimed them fully. "You are displeased," he observed, not as accusation but as fact. Eliza rested her gloved hands upon the cold stone rail, gathering her thoughts before answering. "I am unsettled," she corrected gently. Gratitude and humiliation are uneasy companions. The admission cost her pride, yet she refused to disguise it. He regarded her profile in the silver light, his expression neither offended nor indulgent. "Humiliation," he replied, "belongs to those who wield cruelty. You have committed no such offense." She turned toward him then, the crimson velvet darkened by shadow, her eyes luminous with restrained emotion. "My mother believed necessity justified betrayal," she said quietly. "Tonight, your generosity risks inviting the same judgment upon you. I would not see you diminished on my account." The confession revealed more than caution. It unveiled the core of her fear, that she might again be bartered, this time by circumstance rather than blood. Alaric stepped closer, though not enough to threaten her composure. "I am not diminished by my choices, Miss Hawthorne," he answered, his voice low but unwavering. "I am defined by them." The words settled between them with deliberate gravity. He removed one glove, exposing a hand marked not by softness but by the faint scars of discipline and training. From his finger he slipped a signet ring bearing the crest of Ashford House, its silver surface etched with authority long unquestioned. Eliza's breath caught, not at the jewel's value, but at the intimacy of the gesture. "I do not offer this as spectacle," he continued, placing the ring in her gloved palm and folding her fingers gently around it. "Nor as charity. I offer it as assurance that my presence beside you is neither whim nor rebellion. It is intention." The metal felt cool against her skin, solid and undeniable. She searched his face for signs of impulsiveness and found none. His gaze held the steady clarity of a man accustomed to command, yet newly willing to risk it. "You scarcely know me," she whispered, though the protest lacked conviction. He regarded her with quiet intensity. "On the contrary," he said, "I have observed you long before this evening. I saw you in the village square, kneeling beside a widow whose grief others found inconvenient. I saw you surrender the last of your coin to a child who had none. You moved without audience, without expectation of praise. That is knowledge enough to warrant respect." The revelation startled her more profoundly than the ring. She had believed her small acts invisible, shielded from scrutiny by insignificance. Emotion rose within her, not fragile but fierce. "Respect," she echoed, tasting the unfamiliar sweetness of the word applied to her without condition. "It is a rare commodity." Alaric inclined his head slightly. "Then it shall not be rare in my company." For a moment the frost-laced air seemed to soften, as though winter itself hesitated before their exchange. Yet beneath the warmth of recognition lingered the undeniable truth of consequence. Inside the ballroom, laughter swelled, and through the glass Eliza glimpsed her mother's rigid posture among the crowd. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes were fixed upon the terrace, sharp with calculation and something perilously close to fear. The sight tightened Eliza's chest. "She will not yield easily," she murmured, half to herself. Alaric followed her gaze and understood at once. "Nor should she," he replied evenly. "Resistance clarifies resolve." Eliza looked down at the ring enclosed within her grasp. To accept it publicly would alter more than gossip. It would tether her future to a man whose influence reshaped destinies. Yet to refuse would confirm society's quiet assertion that she lacked courage equal to opportunity. The central conflict crystallized before her. Dignity demanded independence, yet independence had rendered her vulnerable to betrayal. Was alliance a surrender or a reclamation? "I cannot be rescued," she said at last, lifting her eyes to his. "I will not exchange one dependency for another." The words rang clear in the winter air. Alaric did not recoil. Instead, a faint, approving warmth entered his expression. "Nor would I ask you to," he replied. "I seek a partner, Miss Hawthorne, not a possession." The distinction struck her with startling force. Before she could answer, the terrace doors opened abruptly, admitting a gust of music and the unmistakable silhouette of her mother standing just within the threshold. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze dropped to Eliza's closed hand, where the signet ring gleamed faintly beneath moonlight, and in that charged silence Eliza understood that whatever choice she made next would no longer belong solely to her heart. Mrs. Hawthorne stepped fully onto the terrace, the lamplight from the ballroom casting her figure into sharp relief against the winter night. Her expression bore the brittle composure of a woman accustomed to navigating ruin with calculation rather than confession. Her gaze did not rise first to her daughter's face, but to the closed hand at Eliza's side, where the outline of the signet ring pressed unmistakably against crimson velvet. In that silent assessment lay accusation, alarm, and a desperate instinct to regain control. "Eliza," she said, her voice measured yet edged with steel, "you have kept distinguished company this evening." The words, though polite, carried the unmistakable weight of scrutiny. Eliza met her mother's gaze without flinching. "I have been treated with respect," she replied evenly. The distinction was deliberate. Lord Alaric Ashford inclined his head in acknowledgement of the tension gathering between them, his posture neither defensive nor withdrawn. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes shifted to him at last. "My lord," she continued, offering a curtsy that balanced deference with calculation, "I trust my daughter has not presumed upon your generosity." The implication hovered unmistakably, that Eliza's presence, her gown, even her proximity to the alpha of Ashford House might be construed as opportunistic. Alaric regarded her with composed gravity. "Presumption," he answered calmly, "is seldom the failing of those denied advantage. I assure you, madam, it is I who have sought your daughter's company." The quiet authority of his response disrupted her momentum. Mrs. Hawthorne's composure faltered, revealing the anxiety beneath. "Society," she pressed, lowering her voice yet sharpening its intent, "is not forgiving of impropriety." The word struck like a gloved slap, designed to wound without spectacle. Eliza felt the old reflex to shrink beneath maternal censure, yet the weight of the ring within her palm steadied her spine. "Impropriety implies deception," Eliza said, her tone respectful but resolute. "There has been none." Her mother's eyes flashed with something between frustration and disbelief. "You speak as though consequence does not exist," she retorted. "We survive by understanding it." The confession was unvarnished. Survival had long governed her choices, even when it demanded betrayal. For the first time, Eliza saw not merely the architect of her humiliation, but the frightened woman behind it. Alaric stepped forward then, his presence altering the very temperature of the air. "Madam," he said, his voice controlled yet resonant, "your daughter's dignity has endured sufficient trial. I will not permit further erosion." There was no aggression in his tone, only certainty. Mrs. Hawthorne's breath caught, the challenge implicit yet undeniable. "And what is it you propose?" she demanded quietly. "I propose transparency," he replied. "If speculation must circulate, let it be anchored in truth." He turned to Eliza, his gaze seeking not compliance but consent. In that silent exchange, the central conflict sharpened. Would she accept public alignment with a man whose power could shield her at the cost of irrevocable attention? Or would she retreat into obscurity to preserve independence untested? Before she could speak, the terrace doors opened wider, admitting the curious stares of several guests emboldened by tension. Among them stood a nobleman of considerable influence, his expression skeptical. "Ashford," he called lightly, though the undercurrent of warning was clear, "we wondered whether the frost had claimed you both." Laughter flickered uncertainly behind him. Alaric did not look away from Eliza. "It seems," he murmured for her alone, "that silence is no longer an option." She drew a breath, feeling the chill of night and the heat of scrutiny converge upon her. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her gloved hand. The signet ring gleamed beneath the terrace lanterns, its crest unmistakable. Gasps rippled from the doorway. Mrs. Hawthorne's composure fractured entirely, her eyes widening in shock. The nobleman stepped forward, his tone no longer amused. "Surely," he said, "such tokens are not dispensed lightly." The implication was unmistakable. Impropriety now threatened not only Eliza's reputation but Ashford's as well. Alaric finally turned to address the gathering, his posture commanding without flourish. "You are correct," he said evenly. "They are not." His gaze swept across the faces before him, unflinching. "I have offered Miss Hawthorne my signet not as ornament, but as declaration of intention." The words fell with deliberate clarity, dismantling ambiguity. A hush descended, thick and electric. Mrs. Hawthorne inhaled sharply. "Intention?" she echoed, the syllables trembling. Eliza felt the gravity of the moment settle upon her shoulders. This was no longer a private exchange but a public reckoning. She could withdraw, return the ring, preserve her autonomy from speculation. Or she could stand beside him and redefine the narrative imposed upon her. Alaric extended his hand toward her, palm upward once more. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying across the terrace and into the ballroom beyond, "it is my formal intention to court you, openly and without apology." The declaration was measured, not impassioned, yet its sincerity resonated more deeply than any dramatic flourish. Eliza's heart thundered, not from fear alone but from the recognition of choice. For so long decisions had been made around her, above her, for her survival rather than her fulfillment. Now, beneath the gaze of society and the wounded watchfulness of her mother, the decision rested unmistakably within her grasp. She stepped forward, placing the ring upon her finger with steady deliberation before accepting his offered hand. "Then let it be known," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor in her pulse, "that I consent to be courted not as beneficiary but as equal." The words transformed the air between them, shifting the narrative from rescue to partnership. Murmurs surged through the gathering, some scandalized, others impressed. Mrs. Hawthorne's shoulders sagged, the fierce grip of desperation loosening into something akin to reluctant awe. The nobleman regarded Ashford with narrowed eyes, calculating political consequences already forming beyond this terrace. Alaric bowed his head slightly to Eliza, not in possession but in acknowledgement. "You honor me," he said quietly, though the words carried unmistakably through the hush. Together they stepped back toward the ballroom, their joined hands a visible challenge to convention. As the doors closed behind them and the orchestra hesitantly resumed its melody, Eliza felt the weight of scrutiny intensify rather than diminish. Courtship under such declaration would not pass unopposed. Allies would question, rivals would maneuver, and her mother's survival instincts would not dissolve overnight. Yet as she met Alaric's steady gaze amid the glittering crowd, she understood that tonight had irrevocably altered the balance of her life. What began as betrayal had transformed into public defiance. And somewhere beyond the chandeliers and whispered calculations, the true battle, for love, for dignity, for power, was only just beginning. Morning broke over Ashford House in a pale wash of silver, the winter sun hesitant as though uncertain it was welcome after a night so charged with declaration. Frost clung to the hedgerows, rendering every branch brittle and luminous, while within the grand estate a different chill had taken hold. Word of Lord Alaric Ashford's public intention had traveled faster than dawn, stirring unease among advisers, relatives, and rivals alike. A courtship openly declared was one matter, a marriage that might follow was another entirely, and power seldom surrendered its preferences without resistance. Eliza stood at the tall window of a modest guest chamber, her crimson gown replaced by simple mourning attire, yet the signet ring remained upon her finger. It felt heavier in daylight, less romantic and more irrevocable. The previous night's applause had dissolved into murmured calculation, and she understood that affection alone would not shield them from scrutiny. She had chosen partnership, yet partnership with the Alpha of Ashford House carried consequence beyond her imagining. A discreet knock sounded, and Alaric entered without flourish, dressed not for spectacle but for deliberation. His expression bore the composed gravity she had come to recognize as armor rather than indifference. "The council has assembled," he said evenly. "They request clarification." The word was courteous, the implication was not. Eliza turned from the window, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you require clarification?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I require conviction," he replied. "Which I possess." The answer steadied her, yet she sensed the weight pressing upon him. Advisers would argue that alliances must fortify estates, not sentiments. They would question her dowry, her lineage's decline, her mother's indiscretions. Every flaw would be catalogued as liability. The battle before them was not of swords but of perception. "I will not be the cause of division within your house," Eliza said, her voice calm though her heart stirred with apprehension. "If your position demands retreat, I shall understand." The words cost her dearly, yet they were offered freely, not as surrender but as testament to her autonomy. Alaric crossed the room in 2 measured strides, halting before her with restrained intensity. "You mistake me," he said quietly. "My position does not dictate my choices. It is shaped by them." He lifted her hand, studying the ring upon her finger as though confirming a vow already made. "A kingdom secured through fear is fragile. A house governed without respect collapses from within. I will not trade integrity for convenience." The conviction in his tone did not thunder. It settled, solid and immovable. Outside the chamber, footsteps and hushed voices signaled gathering pressure. Eliza felt the magnitude of what stood between them and peace. "Your advisers will argue I weaken your claim," she said. "That affection clouds judgment." A faint, almost ironic warmth touched his expression. "Then they misunderstand both affection and judgment," he replied. "I have evaluated risks all my life. You are not one." The admission pierced deeper than flattery could. She stepped closer, compelled not by dependence but by recognition of shared resolve. "And yet," she said gently, "you stand to lose allies." He held her gaze without hesitation. Allies who abandoned principle were never allies at all. The clarity of his reasoning revealed not recklessness but a man weary of compromise masquerading as wisdom. A summons arrived, delivered with rigid courtesy. The council awaited. Alaric extended his arm, not in dominance but in invitation. Eliza accepted, aware that this next encounter would define not merely their union but the narrative surrounding it. Together they entered the long chamber where portraits of ancestors lined the walls, each stern gaze a reminder of legacy. The advisers rose, expressions varying from concern to thinly veiled disapproval. An elder statesman spoke first, his tone grave. "My lord, your announcement last evening has provoked considerable uncertainty. Strategic marriages fortify estates. Sentiment does not. The accusation, though polished, struck directly. Eliza felt every eye upon her, weighing, measuring, dismissing. Alaric did not release her hand. "You mistake sentiment for weakness," he said calmly. "Miss Hawthorne possesses resilience forged in adversity. That strength fortifies more than coin ever could." Murmurs stirred. Another advisor interjected, questioning her family's debts and her mother's reputation. The words pricked, yet Eliza refused to lower her gaze. "If you seek advantage," she said at last, her voice steady despite the tremor in her pulse, "you will find none in me. I bring no fortune beyond character, no alliance beyond integrity. If those are insufficient, I will withdraw." The chamber fell still. Her offer was not theatrical, it was sincere. She would not anchor him to controversy against his will. Alaric turned toward her then, something resolute blazing beneath his composure. "You will not withdraw," he said quietly, though the words carried through the hall. "For I do not intend to release you." He faced the council once more. "My decision stands. I will court Miss Hawthorne openly, and in due course I shall marry her." The declaration landed not as defiance but as decree. Shock rippled through the chamber. The elder statesman's expression hardened. "You risk fracture within your own ranks." Alaric's reply was unwavering. "Then let them fracture. I will not construct my future upon appeasement." His hand tightened around Eliza's, grounding rather than claiming. When they departed the chamber, the corridors seemed longer, the air charged with consequence. Eliza exhaled slowly, the enormity of his commitment settling upon her. "You have altered more than your reputation," she murmured. He paused beneath a tall arched window where winter light spilled across stone. "I have altered nothing," he said softly. "I have merely revealed what was already decided within me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Eliza's breath stilled as he opened it to reveal a ring distinct from the signet, delicate yet resolute, set with a single clear stone that caught the pale sun. "This," he continued, his voice lower now, stripped of public command, "is not for spectacle or council approval. It is for you alone." He met her eyes, and in them she saw neither strategy nor rebellion, only certainty. "Eliza Hawthorne, will you consent not merely to courtship, but to stand beside me as my wife, in defiance of expectation and in preservation of dignity?" The question hung between them, luminous and immense. In that instant she felt the echo of her mother's betrayal, the sting of society's judgment, the weight of consequence, and beyond it, the fragile, radiant possibility of choosing love without surrendering self. Her answer would seal more than affection. It would redefine her place within a world that had once bartered her worth. She looked down at the ring, then back into his unwavering gaze, and the silence that followed seemed to hold the breath of Ashford House itself. Silence gathered in the corridor like a held breath, pressing gently yet insistently against Eliza's ribs as she regarded the ring resting within Alaric's open palm. The winter light filtering through the arched window struck the stone and fractured into quiet brilliance across the stone floor, as though even the morning recognized the gravity of this choice. She felt the past and future converging within a single heartbeat, the humiliation of her soiled gown, the murmurs that had stalked her steps, the public declaration that had reshaped her name. None of it felt distant. All of it stood present, demanding coherence. "Before I answer," she said at last, her voice steady though threaded with emotion, "I must know that I stand beside you not as defiance, nor as proof of your independence, but as your equal." The request was neither timid nor theatrical. It was the distilled essence of every wound she had endured. Alaric did not hesitate. "You stand beside me," he replied, "because you challenge me to be a better man than power alone would require. If ever I sought to make you symbol rather than partner, you would cease to recognize me." His candor carried no embellishment, only certainty. The corridor seemed to narrow around them as though history itself leaned closer. Eliza searched his expression for any trace of ambition masquerading as devotion, yet found instead a steadiness that invited trust without demanding it. "Then yes," she whispered, the word small in volume yet immense in consequence. "I will stand with you." The answer did not echo, yet it reverberated through him. Alaric exhaled slowly, as though relinquishing a tension he had borne alone, and slid the ring onto her finger beside the signet. The two bands rested together, authority and promise intertwined. Their quiet moment fractured with the sharp report of a cane striking stone. Mrs. Hawthorne stood at the far end of the corridor, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed upon her daughter's hand. Whatever fragile reconciliation had begun the previous evening was eclipsed by the sight before her. "You accept?" she demanded, disbelief and something like fear tangling in her tone. Eliza faced her mother not as child but as woman. "I accept respect," she answered calmly. "And I accept choice." Mrs. Hawthorne's composure faltered. "Choice?" she repeated. "You speak of choice as though it were abundance. We have survived by sacrifice." The confession trembled with unspoken guilt. Alaric inclined his head, acknowledging her without surrendering ground. "Madam," he said evenly, "survival purchased through humiliation is no lasting triumph. Your daughter deserves more than endurance." His words were not cruel, they were clear. The tension between mother and daughter sharpened, yet beneath it lay a quieter reckoning. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze softened incrementally as she observed the way Alaric stood, not possessive, not triumphant, but resolute beside Eliza. "And if the house fractures?" she pressed, grasping at practicalities as shield. "If alliances withdraw?" Alaric's answer came without pause. "Then we rebuild upon stronger foundations." Footsteps echoed once more, this time urgent. A young footman approached, pale with agitation. "My lord," he said, bowing quickly, "several members of the council have convened in the great hall. They request immediate audience." The air tightened. The previous declaration had unsettled them. This engagement would ignite open challenge. Eliza felt the weight of the rings upon her finger grow heavier still, yet not burdensome, anchoring. Alaric extended his arm to her once more. "Shall we conclude what we have begun?" he asked quietly. Eliza placed her hand upon his sleeve, aware that every step forward would dismantle illusion. Together they descended the broad staircase into the great hall, where the council gathered beneath ancestral portraits that seemed to glare in judgment. Voices ceased at their entrance. The elder statesman rose again, his expression grave. "My lord, rumors circulate that your intentions have escalated beyond courtship." His gaze shifted pointedly to Eliza's hand. Alaric did not release her. "Rumors often lag behind truth," he replied. "Miss Hawthorne has agreed to become my wife." A collective intake of breath rippled through the chamber. One advisor stepped forward, indignation breaking his restraint. "You jeopardize stability," he insisted. "Other houses will interpret this as weakness." Eliza felt the old sting of being measured and dismissed, yet she refused to retreat into silence. "If stability depends upon exclusion," she said clearly, "then perhaps it deserves to be tested." The audacity of her response unsettled them more than Alaric's authority. The elder statesman regarded her with newfound scrutiny. "And what do you bring to Ashford House?" he asked pointedly. Eliza lifted her chin. "I bring resilience. I bring loyalty freely given, not bartered. I bring the certainty that I will not abandon this house when convenience fades." Her voice did not waver. Alaric's gaze flickered toward her with unmistakable admiration. "You question what she contributes," he said, turning back to the council. "I question what we forfeit by clinging to outdated measures of worth. I will not negotiate her value." His declaration struck with finality. Murmurs rose, fractured, and then stilled as the elder statesman slowly inclined his head. "You leave us little room," he conceded. "If this is your resolve, we shall not openly oppose it. But understand, my lord, scrutiny will intensify." Alaric nodded once. "Let it." When the council dispersed, the great hall felt cavernous and transformed. The portraits seemed less accusatory, more contemplative. Eliza exhaled, the confrontation having crystallized her uncertainty into clarity. She had not been rescued, she had chosen. That distinction steadied her more than any vow. Outside, the frost began to melt beneath hesitant sunlight, droplets sliding from stone like the shedding of old restraints. Mrs. Hawthorne lingered at the threshold, watching her daughter with an expression no longer dominated by calculation. "I believed sacrifice was love," she murmured almost to herself. Eliza approached her gently. "Sometimes it is," she replied. "But not when it erases the one sacrificed." The words were not accusation but invitation. Alaric joined them, his presence no longer confrontational but inclusive. "Madam," he said quietly, "your daughter's strength is no accident. It was shaped within your house." The acknowledgement softened something in Mrs. Hawthorne's bearing, and for the first time she regarded him not as threat, but as ally in her daughter's future. As the sun lifted higher, casting gold across Ashford House, Eliza felt the narrative of her life pivot decisively. The girl whose gown had been sold for survival stood now at the threshold of a different inheritance, one chosen, not imposed. She intertwined her fingers with Alaric's, aware that trials would follow, that whispers would persist, that alliances would shift. Yet beneath the looming challenges lay a certainty forged not in spectacle but in shared conviction. Alaric turned to her, his voice low yet resonant with promise. "They expected scandal," he said softly. "We shall give them endurance." She met his gaze, seeing in it neither conquest nor rescue, but partnership. And as the doors of